for a college kid, he's going to look for the parent for guidance. You may express your opinion. It's going to ultimately be up to that kid to say, okay, I'm going to take my parents' advice. Or he's going to say, you know what, Mom, Dad, while I completely acknowledge what you say and I hear you, I'm still going to go out on the field one more time. 18, there's going to be very little you can do to stop him, whether you tell him to or not. My son knew how I felt. He knew I wanted him to stop, and that was also part of me sitting him down and saying, hey, what are you going to do? He knew when I said, what are you going to do? You have not made it through your concussion protocol.
Welcome to the Fred Opie Show, where we help students, parents, and coaches give their best effort on and off the field. So here it is, your child loves playing football, loves playing ice hockey, loves playing soccer. Male or female, doesn't matter to me. In the case of football, it's a male. But what do you do when your child has had his or her second, third concussion? Doctors are telling you if it happens one more time, you could have some long-term problem situations. If you have been paying attention to what's happening with the NFL, there's a lot of stuff going on out here. And I can tell you, I've had a child who had a concussion that had that child out of operation from October until March of the next year. I mean, that's a long time. I've had student athletes that I teach, one who not only was out of commission from sports, but couldn't come to class because it just was too painful to be even around the light. These are some serious circumstances. And so we're going to talk to Dan Williams, who was a Division I athlete himself at West Point Military Academy, and his son was a wide receiver at Washington State University and actually an NFL prospect. In his 5th year as a student athlete, this decision came front and center. We're going to learn about the choice that he made and how his father and mother walked him through it. There's a lot of information in this podcast, and I hope you will listen up and learn something from it. In addition, we're going to do on the backside of the interview and just talk about the whole experience of dealing with haters. When you're an athlete, you're on the field and you're dealing with haters. You're playing an away game in hostile territory. I can tell you as a college athlete, there were a number of times where places where we played, it was a little scary. And so we're going to learn about that from Dan Williams, how he dealt with it. And hopefully it'll give you some information on if you're a coach in that situation, how to protect your players. If you're a player, best way to handle yourself. This is rich. This is, it could be the situation that you see coming up. And I hope that you learn something from it and move on and share with other people. Let's transition to questions I have about your son, a son who went on to be a Division I football player at Washington State University. Walk us through the recruiting process that you remember. Two parents, but now no longer together in the same house, are trying to help negotiate that process for him as a Division I football player.
Really unique situation with us. While he was being recruited, one, you can divorce a spouse, but you can't divorce you don't divorce your kids.
Say that again. I like that one. Say that again.
You can divorce a spouse, but you don't divorce your kids. A lot of people, unfortunately, they don't understand that. They don't realize that you don't use your kids as a pawn when there's disagreements with you and your ex. We kept it as cordial as possible. The thing that we agreed throughout our entire process was that our most important thing was to make sure that our son remained our number one priority and that he would not be used in that process. And I kid you not, we are best friends to this day. The other thing that occurred during his recruiting process was I was also deployed. I left for my deployment the last day of the day after his last football game, his senior year. And then I left for my deployment. He ended up having roughly about 14, 15 schools to choose from. The thing that we did with him, he sat down, he wrote out, or at least put together a chart, of the schools, pros and cons of each, and, but in terms of recruiting coaches and things like that, whenever he had a coach that was doing a home visit, they scheduled the home visit at a time where I could actually FaceTime in the evening, so that being that I was deployed, so I would Skype in to any of his interviewing that came to his mom's house and coaching. We sat down and we would talk with the coach and have him there as well as his mom. Get all the questions out on board, and also in terms of setting up his visit. The other thing that he would also do the same thing when he went on his visits. He had an ability to get a hold of me during the visits if there were any questions that were asked. Well, while we had to juggle things around a little, I didn't get to participate in the actual visits with him per se when he went. Some of them ahead of time, but I did most of my interaction with him across Skype and across the phone in terms of the whole decision-making process. He made his decision based off of, he thought at the time he wanted to do academically. I expressed to him, I told him during your interview process, when you're going to a school to visit, you're interviewing the coaches as well. It's not just them looking at you, because they have that interest in you. That's why you're going there. But you're also interviewing them. And you need to understand that you're going to be playing for that coach for 4, or if you redshirt, 4 to 5 years. So you need to be comfortable, that's if that coach says this, you need to be comfortable with that coach. Part of your decision needs to be made on your ability to establish a relationship with that coach and how comfortable that coach makes you feel.
In his case, football, he was getting a full scholarship. In lacrosse, most of these places are going to give you a partial scholarship, 10%, 20%, 50%, on very rare occasions, 100%. How much do you think parents should be have a say in the discussion of where the child goes? You start out with 14 schools. As you narrow it down, what do you think parents should be involved in or have the right to be involved in, since they're going to be cutting some of the check?
Me, I think it's the kid's choice. Now, that being said, I think you, as a parent, you also need to set the guidelines and say, okay, well, yes, it's your choice, but here's what I can afford.
There are way too many parents who just, my mother had the old saying, you give a boy a rope, he wants to be a cowboy. And some of these parents, there is no constraint, and the kids are making decisions based on sports and not on the best long-term investment. And so that you don't get out of school with either you, the parent, having a ton of student loans because you couldn't intervene, or the kid carrying a bunch of student loans because you didn't intervene. Affordability, to me, is key. There's no reason why, if you plan proper, you set up a ESA, educational savings account, or a 529 educational savings account that are tax-free, by the way, parents, and you start planning when Johnny is young. If you start regularly investing, you should be able to pay for it. But you don't let the kid sign on to a bunch of debt because you don't have enough sense to say, "Ooh, we can't afford this."
You owe that to both yourself and your kid. If you can't afford it, you need to be able to say that. You can't be too proud not to say it. I told my kids when as they were growing up, even if I could afford to pay 100% of their college, I wasn't going to pay 100% of their college. The max I was going to pay was going to be 75%. They were going to at least flip 25% of the bill because first of all, they needed to have some investment into it. Now, that's not to say that after they figured out how they were going to do that 25%, I couldn't give it back to them later. But I wanted them to figure out how they were going to do that other 25%, because once again, if that was scholarship, if that was them figuring out once again from financially, if I got to work, but I do believe that they need to have some type of an investment into it, because they need to understand that part of it, and the only way that they're going to understand that part of it is to be actively involved and engaged in terms of trying to figure that out and planning of that. So even if just the planning of that, they're going to learn something. You can't put yourself in debt. You know, you don't go out and keep pulling second and third mortgages on your home to try and fund Johnny's education, because that's not going to do you any good later on in life. You're going to be working until you're 80, 90 years old, and it doesn't do anyone any good. You do have to look at the financial side of it. You sit down and you figure out what you can afford from a school standpoint.
Yep.
And you can say, well, okay, you know what? If you choose this school, here's what we can afford. We need to figure out how we're going to get this other, if there's a gap, how are we going to get this other part that we don't have? And talking to the coach, talking to school from a you know, if they have a scholarship, you know, you try and negotiate either a little bit more from a scholarship standpoint, but your financial aid. But here, at the end of the day, here's what you're going to have. What Johnny needs to understand is that at the end of the day, if you go here, here's what you're going to be left with. If you go financial aid or through student loans, you need to understand what you're going to have from a debt standpoint still when you leave. And you need to understand it. That's life. That it's going to take it's hard to pay those back. You know, coming right out, that's got to get paid. $100 grand coming out of college, trying to look for a job, trying to get something set up, and trying to start and get yourself established. And you got this $100,000 loan.
We are at a time period, and I think it began when we were undergraduates, where taking out loans is normal. And I tell people, why you want to be normal? Don't be normal. Get a backbone and say no to the things that you can't afford. Going out and buying cars you can't afford is just as dumb as going out and buying a college education that you can't afford. When it comes to the choice of college, people turn off wisdom. I don't want them to feel bad. Fool, they're going to feel bad 20 years from now when they have $100,000 in debt to pay off because you couldn't say no. Give them the ability to make wise decisions even when they don't. Because some of these people, I mean, look, the bottom line, I'll never forget as an undergrad, I wanted to go to University of Maryland so bad. Why? Because Clay Johnson from my hometown went to University of Maryland. What does that have to do with the price of corn? Nothing.
When I started thinking about what college I want to go to in eighth and ninth grade, I was worried about what my parents could afford. When West Point knocked on the door and they said, you got a 100% free education, that was music to my ears. I hadn't even thought about West Point up until they started recruiting. Now, I had other school opportunities that were offering from a scholarship standpoint, but then you had your Ivy League, you know, you get into, but that don't offer scholarships, but you get the financial aid and all that other things that they tend to work. But part of those are things that you still have to pay back. I went to Brown. I fell in love with Brown, campus-wise, school-wise. It was awesome. Don Sarzer was coach there at the time. I thought he was an awesome guy. I just didn't think from a financial standpoint that I wanted to put that pressure on my parents and also on myself. The whole thing with the academy goes, I just didn't know if I wanted to go into the military. Prep school became an opportunity there. So I went to the academy prep school, fell in love with it, and ended up going into academy. It ended up working out well for me. But Dick left, and then Jack Emma came in. Dick Adele recruited me. Jack actually I knew because he did recruit me for Washington League. Jack Emma actually ended up turning out to be an incredible, not just an incredible coach for me, but an incredible friend. One of those coaches who really, for whatever reason, connected with me really well, both on a player relationship wise, but also on a personal level, and where I felt he could tell when things were bothering me, and I don't know if it was because that I played differently on the field or did it whatever, but you know I struggled a little my freshman year at the academy through had one or two other personal issues that came up. I didn't say anything to him about it, and he knew something was wrong. Found out, and he goes, something's bugging you. Sat and talked with him about it. ended up having the two co-captains of the team sit down with me and watch over me and stuff. But it ended up being a little bit of a struggle. I mean, to the point where I actually thought about leaving the academy. That's why it's important. It is so important to make sure that, not just from a schooling standpoint, but if you're gonna play, if you truly want to play, that you understand that you have that relationship, whether it's with the head coach or your, if you're playing football, position coach, or whatever, that you're able to establish that type of relationship, because you spend a lot of time with those coaches and those players. So they become your extended family. They become the people that you depend on. So it's very important to make sure that you're able to have that relationship with someone that you can go to and talk to in those scenarios that will definitely help out you once you get into the school.
A question about your son. So he goes on to Washington State. He's a wide receiver. He suffers a number of injuries during his college athletic experience. Tell us about that, the injuries he suffered and the support you and his mom gave him, and the decision for him to stop playing football ultimately before he graduated.
He ended up having, I think it was 4 concussions. And the fourth one occurred his senior year. I believe it was the second, may have been the second game of the season. Quasi cleared the protocol. He was still having headaches. We were just trying to figure out, well, what does he want to do at this point? How does he feel now? So this ended up being probably one of the most difficult decisions he ended up having to make, but it was also ended up being a reality check for him, because, he's going through the protocol, and while he sat and looked, and he says, you know what? He goes, I love football, but I'm not in love with football. He realized that there's other things to life that he still wanted to be able to do and enjoy, that he felt were much bigger than football. I want to be able to enjoy those other things in life, physically be able to function. And I let him talk himself through the process. It still has to be his decision. He's a grown man at this point. I know what I wanted to do, and I think I know what's best for him. But I also don't want him to ever be in a situation where he's later on in life second guessing himself, saying, I could have done this, I could have done that, I wish I would have done this, wish I would have done that.
How would you have handled this if he was a freshman and this happened?
I would have handled it the same way. Have always told my kids, if you went up to either one of them, both the son and daughter, if you go up to one of them and says, okay, what does your dad tell you about consequences? And they'll sit down and say, oh, okay, well, he always says, well, with every choice, there's a consequence. He tells me to think about the consequences, both good and bad, of that choice. Because if you can live with the worst consequence of that choice, and you're okay with it, then go ahead and move forward with it. And if you don't think you can live with that worst consequence, you need to change your path, a direction that you're going in.
If a kid is 18, 19 years old, does he or her have the ability to think about the consequences in a wise way?
I think they do if it's something that you start out with them earlier. If that's the mindset that you get them thinking in early, and you get them used to making decisions that way. Anything in life, if you start them out early in terms of thinking about those things and at least jotting them down, that's going to be a process that they use. They've got to answer that question. We as parents want to protect our kids. We play those sports. Things are going to happen.
We now have enough information to know that as a child, when you get a concussion, it makes you prone to better chance that it happening again and again and again when you're young. And that, we know this now. So the fact that I think football, and I think even some of these other contact sports like lacrosse or like ice hockey, you grew up playing ice hockey, and I know that some of these sports may go the way of football. Go the way of boxing, in the sense that boxing is generally the kid who comes from the roughest neighborhood with the least amount of education, and they get in that ring and do that kind of stuff. I think football, as educated parents, they're going to opt their kids out because they know more, versus parents who are not exposed to this information. And I'll give you, for an example, classmate who parents were not very educated. And the boy loved football, and the boy had multiple concussions in fourth, fifth, and sixth grade. And the parents never pulled him out. Now, at the same time, he had teammates, multiple concussions, and the parents were much more educated, much more aware of the situation, and they just pulled the kid out of the sport, and that was it for sports until anymore. Versus the other one, well, he's doing really good. The team's really good, and he loves football. Let him keep playing. When you look at those situations, it really makes a parent have to think, what's the best choice in the long run? And they're right. I agree. There's a point where a child has to make these choices, but I'm also thinking about the psychologists who say that a child's frontal cortex, particularly the male, doesn't come together with the ability to weigh consequences until probably about the age of 25 or thereabouts. That's why we have child soldiers being recruited by people, because you give that kid a gun and you load them up on some marijuana or some other drugs, they'll do just about anything because they don't have the ability to choose and make choices based on consequences.
Whether it's 8, 9, 11, 12, whatever. But in that situation, I completely agree. For a college kid, he's going to look for the parent for guidance. You may express your opinion. It's going to ultimately be up to that kid to say, okay, I'm going to take my parents' advice. Or he's going to say, you know what, Mom, Dad, while I completely acknowledge what you say and I hear you, I'm still going to go out on the field one more time. 18, there's going to be very little you can do to stop him, whether you tell him to or not. My son knew how I felt. He knew I wanted him to stop, and that was also part of me sitting him down and saying, hey, what are you going to do? He knew when I said, what are you going to do? You have not made it through your concussion protocol. Ultimately, my son wanted to go to law school. I love football. I'm in love now with my new goals and aspirations, and he wanted to go to law school. And he, ultimately he wants he says, you know what, I want to be a judge. At what level? The highest level he can get to. He wanted to be able to get into the best law school that he could. He goes, I need my brain to be able to do that. So he made the decision. He says, okay, well, in order to be able to do that, I need to stop now. So he stopped. He ended up, using the second half of that year to study for his LSAT. He got into 4 of the top 10, three of the top 10 law schools nationally. He ended up choosing. He's at Bolt Law School, Berkeley, finishing up his second year, doing great there, and he loves it. He doesn't have any regrets in his decisions. Made my choices in life is by just thinking about the consequences of my choices.
Love what you're saying. To me, I would liken it to the importance of financial literacy. That if you want your kids to have financial literacy, you got to start young. And what you're talking about, if you want your kids to have decision literacy, you got to start young. And unfortunately, if you make all of the choices for your child, even at the college level, they will never develop decision-making literacy.
Exactly. They've got it. At some point, you've got to let go. You're making choices for them all the way up until they get out of college. It's too late. And they go out and they still make bad choices, both in financially in their spending, and they have nothing to show for it afterwards. They go out and make bad choices in terms of who they associate themselves with, what they're doing, who they're running around with, and they end up losing everything they spent all this time and effort putting into it, and now they've got nothing. Now they've got nothing to show for it. I think every college athlete needs to take a financial management class. That's the first thing they should put them into. Coming into that should be a required course. First thing they come into as a freshman. You need to understand finance.
3 classes I think should be required for all college graduates: financial literacy, choice or decision-making literacy, and then I think cooking literacy. The fact that you could go out in society and you can't prepare food for yourself, to me, you're not prepared for life. I do like the fact that the Ivy Leagues, if my understanding is correct, is that you cannot graduate from any Ivy League schools unless you can pass a swimming test, which I also think is a tremendously smart thing to do to make part of your college curriculum.
West Point, you have to pass a swimming test. The cooking literacy ones. My mom actually said my sons will always know how to cook, and you will know how to wash and iron your own clothes. So she made sure that we knew how to at least cook something.
Yeah.
We knew how to clean our clothes. You have to depend on anyone to show you how to do that. Now, it wasn't necessarily all healthy cooking because my mother's from the South, so they did a whole lot of fried chicken and all those other things. Later on in life, learned about the good aspect of cooking, the healthy cooking, and things that you need to really pay attention to, that you should have paid attention to when you're younger, but definitely as you get older.
Preparing your child to succeed and not being scared to let them fail. I think failure is a great teacher. You support your kids, but you don't want them in a situation where they think failure is the end of the world, because it's not. I mean, some of the best discoveries scientifically happen because of failure, and that failure is a part of the process of learning how to get better, learning how to get smarter, and parents, don't be scared to let that happen.
I would agree with you. You learn through both your achievements as well as through the things that you fail at. And it's how you respond to those failures that matter. Not let them get you down, but you learn to pick yourself up and move forward.
The show will be right back. For related content on negotiating the world of school and sports, visit our website at fredopie.com. Check out our podcast archive and review the show on SoundCloud, Stitcher, and iTunes. The best way to support the podcast is to tell a friend, share the show on Facebook and Twitter, or send them to our website at fredopie.com.
Hey listeners, if you're enjoying this episode with Dan Williams, you might really enjoy the interview Fred did with Dr. Bill Sparks on sports injuries, battling depression, and becoming a doctor. It's available on the Fred Opie Show page on SoundCloud, iTunes, or Stitcher. And here's a short clip.
Coming off of surgery, transferring from Herkimer to Syracuse, if somebody had diagnosed me, I think I probably would have been clinically depressed.
100%.
And you felt the same way?
I was displaced because I couldn't be with the team. My interactions with the team was somewhat already different because I was like a real straightforward student, squared away. Like I wasn't out and about with the guys as much. And then I had the injury, kind of my play fell off. I couldn't practice in the fall. 100% depressed back then.
Wow.
No doubt in my mind, depressed. Yeah. But
did your parents know what you were going through? Did you clue them into it all?
No, I mean, my parents created an awesome environment in terms of being caring, giving me the things I needed. I don't think they just had the capacity to understand the college experience. They definitely didn't have the capacity to know that I was kind of quote-unquote depressed.
Once again, that was Fred's interview with Dr. Bill Sparks. If you're enjoying the show, don't forget to tell a friend, spread the word, send people to SoundCloud, iTunes, or Stitcher to listen to other episodes of the show, and fredopie.com to find more information on Fred Opie. Now back to the interview with Dan Williams. Thanks again for listening to the show.
And around the country, students are increasingly facing race-based hatred after Donald Trump's 2016 election victory. I remember similar situations as a student athlete. Tell us about your experience at Hempstead High School. You guys had an all African-American team, but also at West Point as a way of educating listeners and strategizing on how to deal with haters and support teammates who encounter them. Oftentimes, teammates would, for example, invite me to go to local bars or parties in a place where I didn't feel comfortable. And they didn't know when I walked in a place that I had people turn around looking at me. Now, I know sometimes this may sound like black paranoia, but these are just issues that I would love for listeners to hear.
Okay, well, high school, you're right. Hempstead High was, when I went there, roughly about 95, 97% African American high school. So there was very little both diversity in the school as well as within the athletic program. The athletic program was, you're right, when we went to sporting events, it was all black athletes, and everyone knew that. Most of the teams that we actually played out on Long Island were quite the opposite. While they may have had some diversity, when going to games, you'd have fans that would make racial comments, African jungle bunnies. You'd hear all those type things being called at you while you were in the stands. If you played on the varsity team, you were sure to have a white coach. You know, Don Ryan, who actually worked within the community with the kids while growing up, Hank Lundy, Al Hodish, they were all aware of what you were going to face when you went to those games, and they tried to prepare you and talk to you a little bit about it. First time going outside the community and being faced with that, it was a bit of a scary, but to me it was a bit of a scary situation. My upbringing was, and also the way the coaches and stuff were trying to tell you, is that you proved your point on the field. At the end of the day, it's the scoreboard and what you put out there on the field. Try not to get into a fist fight, because that wasn't going to do you any good either. Because ultimately, unfortunately, you were going to get blamed. So if you got into a fist fight, 90% of the time, we didn't have cameras and stuff with us those days to catch the video of who actually started what. It was going to be assumed that it was the black team that came in there that started it, whether it was a home event and or away event. If there was a fight, 90% of the time, 95% of the time, everyone automatically assumed it was the black teams that were the ones that, or our team was the one that initiated, and or our fans were the ones that initiated the fight, a fight that may have occurred in the stands as a result of someone saying something.
How often did that actually happen, where fights broke out on the field because some racial epithet was said by an opponent or by a fan in the stands? We're not talking about the 1970s. You graduated in what year?
I graduated from high school in '82. 25, 30% of the time, someone may have said something that initiated someone throwing a fist or whatever, trying to get at you. But there were, I can also tell you, is that there were a lot of stuff that was said on the field. I mean, I played lacrosse, but I also played football. For me, it occurred more in football than it did with lacrosse. And you had larger crowds. Same thing. I would say with the larger size events and venues, you had a bigger chance of something occurring, and it probably occurred more there than it did on the lacrosse field. It did rear its head on lacrosse. You know, you'd have someone that would say something out on the field at you, but the thing that you would try and do is, you know what, you hit them a little harder. I played defense. I was usually a little bit bigger, and you'd whack them a little harder, and you knock them down, and when you knock them down, you stood over them and you say, "Did you say something?" The way that you get through it is through education. You still need to get your education to get yourself to get out of it. 95, 98% black school at Hempstead High was not rated as a very well-known school for its academic prowess, you know, while going there. A lot of those really good athletes really didn't go anywhere because they didn't put the time in from an educational standpoint. You get a handful that actually make it, but there were so many more good athletes that were at our school that could have gone on to do great things. They just didn't perform in the classroom. That's the key to how you overcome it.
Hempstead High School in the 1940s and 50s was one of the top high schools in the country. But after the close of Mitchell Air Force Base, Hempstead experienced what I call white flight. I call it green flight or capital flight, because some of the most educated African Americans who had the ability left the school district to either put their kids in private schools or move to another district. So this is not just about race. I think it's more about class than anything else. What was the difference for you? Your parents stayed in Hempstead. They raised you in Hempstead. I'm thinking of Reggie Terry. I think about a number of people like Reggie, who went on to be a parade All-American, played football at Syracuse University, played lacrosse for me when I was a high school coach in Hempstead. What was the difference for families like the Terrys and your family? And why did you guys end up having those opportunities while everybody else fell between the cracks?
I would also think it comes back down to parenting. We were, I'd say, lower middle class, but I know it felt like we needed anything. But once a year, we would try to do a vacation or try to do something special. Being able to expose you to some of the opportunities that are out there once a year, it's enough to get you motivated enough that you're going to want it more for yourself and for your kids. You know, he motivated me to say, you know what, I like what I see. The way that I'm going to be able to do it is by hard work. The hard work comes in the classroom. The classroom, from an educational standpoint, both playing hard in the field and playing and doing what I needed to do academically. You know, I saw that as a way out. Starting in 8th grade, I knew my parents were going to have a hard time both paying for college. I started focusing on how am I going to be able to help them help me. You know, you look for sports, look for the sport that was gonna get you out. Regardless of the school that you go to, even if they say the academics are bad, there's usually some good teams. And I sought out the good teams. I didn't let them seek me out. I sought them out. And it's about taking charge of your own destination. But I also looked for teachers that I knew that cared for students. Sought them out, made sure I ended up in their classes, and did well with them. I didn't know I had to take an SAT until halfway through my junior year. Mm-hmm. It was, I started applying college and said, well, you got to take these SATs, the ACT test. That was the first I heard of it. I went to my guys, I said, what's an SAT? It's not just the academics in class that I got to do. Now I got to take this test to try and figure out, am I going to be able to get in college, with this test? We hadn't been taught in Hempstead how to take SAT. So when I first took the SAT, I want to say 840, 900, somewhere in there, combined score.
So if you're a coach, you got a great athlete, but he's not applying himself, or he just doesn't even understand. You might have went to college, coach, but this kid is clueless about SAT, GPA, the importance of going to school, raised by the grandparents, who have never gone to college. I don't even know if they finished high school. And a school is interested in him, but the grandparents are reluctant to send him away. I don't want him going off like that. I don't want him to become a white boy. I don't know if they can handle it. I don't know if I can afford it. What do you say to the coach who is trying to expose the kid to the college opportunities and expose the parents or grandparents to, look, this is a great opportunity for you, but this may mean this kid has to go 2 hours away from you and you may only see them on holidays?
Try to get the grandparents, to visit the school. Get them out there to meet their staff. Those are the things that they may have to do for those 1 or 2 students where they have that parent or grandparent who's never been exposed to something like that. And then also really have that sit down with the grandparents and say, listen, get a chance to grow, to be able to be exposed to something that's going to allow him to be better, grow out and put himself in a better position, both to himself, his future family, your quote unquote, your future grandkids that he may have.
Coaches who are recruiting these kids, whether it be to the prep school or the colleges, they're not thinking about the safety factor. I grew up in a small town, mostly white folks. My parents moved from a town that had a rather large population of black folks to my hometown to give me better education. Now, my mother, she remembers growing up in the 1950s where she couldn't be a cheerleader because she was black. They didn't have black cheerleaders. But she did not know what was going on in the schools with me and the kind of cultural combat I had to deal with folks. So the ideal of sending these kids to this private school, or in many cases in Baltimore, you have these places where prep school coaches are going into the hood and finding the best athletes, whether it be basketball, football, lacrosse, and getting them to come to those schools. but they don't know what those kids have to deal with. My mother, one of the mantras she told me growing up in the 1970s, 70s, and early 80s was, don't bring home no blue-eyed Susies. Don't come home dating no white girls. Why? She was scared for my safety. What would some racists say if they saw me walking hand in hand with some white girl and there was nobody around, and now they decided it's time to be emboldened and put me in my place?
That still exists. A lot of people feel that, we're so far past that. We're not. You still have people that are getting beat up for those, or at least, ridiculed a lot for those same reasons. People feel empowered again to be able to say those things, and it seems to come out. We know how to protect them in this environment. You're trying to send him to this other environment where he has no idea of what to expect, or he's got no other friends, other than you saying that you're going to take care of him. Well, how are you going to take care of him? I need to see how you are going to take care of him. I need to be sure that he has resources or someone to go to, someplace to go, to make sure that he's not going to end up still as another statistic, even once I let him go there. No one's going to be able to feel empowered to take him out.
Physically, are they going to be okay? Emotionally, they're going to be okay, because when you are one of the few, which you were and I were in college in the 1980s, many times you're on your own. I can tell you, off the field, I didn't hang out with the guys on my team from Syracuse because they had a whole different definition of fun, and they had more spaces where they could go to have fun.
West Point's a bit unique in terms of the actual school environment. The 4 years that I was there on the lacrosse team, I was the only black player. Your teammates at the academy also help you through the rigors that you go through at the academy itself, just the challenges that you do there. So they help you get through some of those that are, it's not about the going out and partying, but being able to take care of you within that environment. You don't really see the race card being played there. Throughout the 4 years that I was there, there were 3 events. These were fan related, and one specifically where some of the players on the team actually heard a fan that was behind the bench say something. The fan ended up having to move because a couple of players heard it, and they were going to go after the fan. I can truly say that the players on my team were clearly behind me, and they were quote unquote my brothers, and they would take care of me in any situation.
If you are on a team and you see your teammate, I don't care if he's black, I don't care if he's short, I'm not sure, whatever the reason is for people to act the fool and go after that person, you need to stand up for him. And I think you also need to realize that there are some spaces that you go into. Could be the situation reversed where, you're on a football team and the majority of the guys, or a basketball team, the majority of the guys are black. You can't just bring some white cat on your team into any old space. It's not as safe as people necessarily think. So the fact that they came to your aid, I think, is really important. Being silent is being complicit. You need to stand up and say that is not acceptable.
Whether a better job or a good job in terms of looking out for one another. They truly need to try and put themselves in other person's shoe. A lot of the players that I played with were conscious of it, that all-black team, and then going into the complete opposite, where, okay, now I'm the only black person. Kind of get do I really belong here? How am I going to fit in? How am I going to just find my space here? Try and prove yourself on the field or whatever. But you still have to have that social outlet, have that social interaction with your teammates. I don't know if it was just the consciousness of the guys, but a lot of them, when if we did go out, they tried to make sure I was okay with where we were going. And that was something I appreciated.
The conversation is a shout out to the makers of the movie Remember the Titans with Denzel. That's one of my favorite movies, talking about these kind of issues of hatred that are race-based that happen in sports. Dan Williams has a lot to share there that I like. I think it pertains to a lot of what goes on in high school and college sports. The importance of, as a teammate, looking out for the members of your team who may be from a marginalized group, and the sensitivity that you need to have if you have somebody from one of those marginalized groups. I think the importance of sports that I certainly learned about was, the idea I got your back. I don't care if you're playing football, basketball, or soccer, but communication and having somebody's back is critical. And I think that's true on and off the field. And parents, teaching your children how to make good decisions. I've always said that we have to keep in mind when you're dealing with children, whether it be grades 13 to probably the late 20s, that frontal cortex is not completely aligned and together. So children are making executive decisions that in the most instances are very impulsive. And you need to get them to think about the questions behind their decisions, the consequences behind your decisions, but you got to teach them to do that. You can't make every decision for your child, but you have to have your child processing things in a way where they're thinking about the long-term consequences of the decision about to make, and allow them to fail. Failure is a great teacher. There's nothing wrong with it at all. And I think sometimes we have such a soft landing that we create for these kids, and they're not learning anything. I always tell the parable of the eagle. The eagle in nature builds its nest and puts some hard rocks underneath at the bottom of that nest. And when that baby eagle grows to a certain weight, that nest becomes uncomfortable. And that eagle is out of there going to establish his or her own life. And parents, we need to do the same thing. It can't be so comfortable at home that your child is 30 years old and still living in your basement. You hear me? As I tell my two kids who I love dearly, the only two people staying in this house long term are your mother and I. I am training you to go and not to stay. And I think that's very wise when it comes to teaching your child how to make decisions, whether it be about where they're going to go to college or what they're going to do when they get to college, including changing their major, deciding whether to play or not, when someone has just told you that you've had multiple concussions and you're now putting yourself at peril. The best interest of the child is going to be made by the child and by the parent together. Thanks again for listening to the show. I love giving talks on the topic of school and sports. For more information, email the show at fdopie@gmail.com. Once again, that's fdopie@gmail.com. You can also contact us if you're interested in advertising on the show. The best way to support the podcast is to tell a friend, share the show on Facebook and Twitter, or send them to our website at fredopie.com. Thanks for listening, and be good.